Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Columbia University. Welcome to our New York Clean Energy Transmission Summit. My name is David Sandalow. I'm the inaugural fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and we are thrilled to be convening this meeting today on New York Clean Energy Transmission. We have a remarkable group of speakers. We have a remarkable group of people in the room. Just to paraphrase John Kennedy, I think this is the best gathering of talent on the New York electricity market since Thomas Edison dined alone. It's really amazing to look around the room and see who's here. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue on stage. I'm looking forward to the dialogue among ourselves. I'm also looking forward to participation from everybody on the web. Thank you very much for joining us. We had a very large wait list to get into this event. I'm sorry we didn't have a bigger room to accommodate everybody. But please, if you're listening on the web, you can join us by Twitter. You can follow us on Twitter always at Columbia U Energy. And if you want sending questions, use hashtag CGEP events, Center for Global Energy Policy Events, CGEP events. Here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we have a number of events coming up, which I wanted to tell you about. We have an event on February 12th on Russia and the Arctic, if you're interested in that. And February 16th, we have an event with Spencer Dale, the chief economist of British Petroleum, is going to be talking about their annual energy outlook. And then we have a steady series of events after that. One of the real pleasures of planning this event for me and for our team at the Center on Global Energy Policy has been the chance to work with the team in America's Clean Energy Grid. And I really want to thank the team there for all the amazing work they've done. John Jimison and Monica Dean and Bill White and their colleagues have done a tremendous job. So I want to thank them and turn the program now over to my good friend John Jimison.
Well, thank you very much. I am John Jimison. My normal button says Managing Director of the Energy Future Coalition, but the Energy Future Coalition runs a collection of projects which are aimed towards a clean energy economy in a broad bipartisan way. And one of our projects, and the one we're here today, is Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. So thank you all for coming. I particularly want to thank our wonderful collection of speakers. I don't know how we got everybody in the room who's in it, but you want to be here today. This is not for techno geeks. This is the key linchpin issue of the electricity future in our view. A couple of program changes. A very happy surprise. You may have noticed if you saw our early programs that we listed Pat Hoffman as invited. Well, on Monday she turned down the invitation, and on Tuesday we got Bill Hederman, and he's here with us. So I hope you picked up Bill's picture and bio. It was separate from the program. He's not listed, but he's going to be joining our third panel this afternoon. The other news, which could have been bad news, was that we were afraid that Mike Eckhart wasn't going to be able to join us because an important business meeting came up. But he said, well, I can be there in the morning. So he's going to be on the second panel instead of the fourth panel. But don't miss the fourth panel. That is going to be a blockbuster panel anyway. The focus of the conference is a bit unique. And ASEG is a bit unique because we focus on the issues of the high voltage grid. A lot of what's going on in the electric sector is going on, as you're going to learn in big time in the first panel, at the distribution utility level. And there's a lot going on with new technologies, a lot going on with changes in generation. The high voltage grid, in our view, remains the backbone of the system, remains critical to the system, and in fact, if we don't deal with the issues of the high voltage grid successfully, we're not going to get where we need to go for reliability, for security, for economics, and especially for integrating clean energy into the economy. Okay. That's my sales pitch for what, but we really try when we do these conferences to get all the stakeholders into the room, different perspectives, have a dialogue, and try to reach a consensus at the end of the day that, yeah, nothing tougher than building transmission. It's expensive, it's intrusive, it's ugly. Nobody's ever suggested a landscape is improved if you'd only drape a high voltage line across it. But it has to be done. So we've got to manage to overcome the issues that can divide us on it and find a way to work together. And so we've got all the right people in the room to figure out what these issues are, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, what the potential is for New York, the New York region, and in fact, probably the broader Northeast region. And that's what we're here to do today. So we urge all of you to be active and participate. We're going to try to leave lots of time for questions and dialogue. A couple of practical notes. Read the introductions, or read the biographies of the people in your program. We're not going to repeat them from up here. That's going to save us a little time, and you're going to understand from that exactly why these are exactly the right people. And help us stay on time. We've got a packed program. It's very easy for it to delay. So treat the 15-minute breaks like 5-minute breaks and try to be back in your chairs at the end of them. And we're going to be rougher than we ought to be with the speakers to make sure they don't use the time they're entitled to because of their places, but only the time we can allow because of the program and the need to involve the audience fully. Take any conversations, networking, et cetera, phone calls outside the room, please. If your phone rings in the room, we're going to insist that you put it on speaker and hold it up so everybody can hear the conversation. And then we will be eager to get started. So Steve, why don't you and your panel come on up and take your places, and we will launch. Does anybody?
Thanks, John. Welcome. I'm the moderator. I think that means that I have only a moderate or modest amount of, maybe a couple of minutes, as opposed to speakers. They get the full allotment, the full 10 minutes. 5 is always, we're going to have so much time we'll be able to leave at noon. Good. So as was mentioned, the Institution of Public Utilities Fortnightly started January 1929. I just took it over. The first issue, hopefully, is a startling change. Just came out. It's in the mail. And hopefully it's a dramatic change from what you've seen recently. So, but as people know, if they get my daily columns, my daily digital columns, I like to push thought-provoking factoids. So here's 3 to motivate today. From, if you saw my one of my columns earlier this week, if you took, according to the Energy Department, the esteemed Energy Department that's well represented here, 2015 through November, first 11 months of 2015, you take the residential solar in New York State, average it over the hours, it's 29 megawatt hours per hour. Still have a little ways to go. It's currently 29 megawatt hours per hour. Second factoid. Nationally, electricity is only, according to the Commerce Department, is only 1.5%. Actually, it's, the latest month came in at 1.37% of personal consumer expenditures. So of all the money that consumers have to spend on goods and services, 1.37% in December, in this case, was spent on electric bills. So it's pretty small. So if we're going to make that smaller, we're getting to a really small number. But here's the thing. In New York, it's probably around 1. Probably around 1%, because that 1.37% includes the South and other parts of the country. We actually, in this part of the country, have higher than average income and consumption expenditures. And we're pretty efficient, actually, in New York, especially in the city. So it's probably about 1%. Third factoid. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're in a very dense city. And so we have buildings that have load average or peak that are in the megawatts. 1 megawatt is about 4,000 solar panels. We got to squeeze a lot of stuff in here. Now, these factoids seem daunting for the challenges ahead to create a clean energy economy. So I think I'll leave you with a really favorite quote of mine from the popular culture. I don't know if anyone has seen the movie The Martian. And at the end of that great movie, Matt Damon, inspiring the people there, said, you got to work the problem. Otherwise, you don't live, you die. So let's work the problem. The first speaker is one of the rock stars of our industry, Chair Zibelman, and she'll maybe have a few things to say about where we're heading.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. It's absolutely a delight to be here. And it is really a terrific lineup of speakers. I'm really looking forward to the day. I have to say that it's always a little bit daunting to me anymore about either how old I am or just how small this industry is. But looking around this room, I feel like I'm in one of these odd dream sequences where you have people from all walks of your life showing up that shouldn't know each other but seem to know each other. So it's so great to be around so many new and old friends. So there's what I want to do is really, my topic and focus is really the correlation between how we see transmission and REV. And a lot of people I know think about REV as about distributed energy, but it's really not. It's really about optimizing the entire system. And so what we want to talk about today, or I want to talk about, is how what we're trying to do about in REV, about really regulatory reform and industry reform, ties into thinking about both the bulk power system as well as the distributed system very differently moving into the future. So one of the things I was thinking about when I was putting together my comments is a number of years ago I was in China and I was visiting with State Grid, and they were talking about the fact that they were putting together a 1,000 gigawatt transmission line from Three Gorges into Beijing because they were having problems. There was so much growth going on so quickly, they had to build a lot of generation and transmission in a very short period of time, and they're building a 1,000 gigawatt transmission, megawatt transmission, going across from the country, and they're planning on getting it done in 5 years. And you know, I was talking to the president of State Grid, and I said, just in my normal naivete, you know, wow, don't you, like, how are you going to do siting and all that kind of stuff? And he looked at me, he said, we just move people. And, you know, as if I were speaking a different language, which I obviously was at the moment. But you know, as we know in the United States, we have a whole different story. When it comes to transmission, there's a lot of things that need to happen before we actually get transmission built. In fact, we did a study when I was at Northern States Power Company, just a sort of matter of curiosity. And if you take a look at sort of transmission development, it's usually 10 years in the planning and 2 or 3 years in the construction, and a lot of costs go through the planning and siting processes because of people's concern. And really the issues turn around to several factors. One certainly is information. You know, a lot of people, the first time you show up and say we need to develop transmission, they haven't heard from you before, and they're very curious as to why you need it. They don't understand it. There's a lot of concern and a lot of anxiety that you're taking property that they might have not looked at. There may be different locations. So getting that information out there, and people, and not just the utilities and the regulators and maybe the ISOs understanding the need, but really getting public understanding of need is a process that we have to go through. The other is suspicion. I mean, there's, you know, obviously when you're taking someone's property, first question is always, do you really need to? Is there a different spot? Can we go somewhere else? Why can't we just live with what we have? And these are all very, very legitimate concerns that folks have. And then the fact that in transmission, as we've seen across the United States, you know, many times transmission solves a multitude of problems. Recently, the New York Commission approved moving forward with our AC transmission, which was really designed to say, look, we've got congestion on our system. We have a lot of assets in the north and the west part of the state. We have a lot of need downstate. And we've never really been able to build transmission because there are multiple utilities involved, and the ability for one utility to defend it was difficult. Several years ago, the utilities got together with NYPA, worked to develop the concept of a transco, so it became it's just sort of a statewide issue, not just a NYSEG versus Con Ed versus grid issue. And that's how we really started to move this thing forward. So thinking about transmission not as a utility building a line to meet its own load, but actually an asset that helps optimize a lot of resources is a very important thing. And also, and probably most importantly, respect for the environment, thinking about how you address land use issues, particularly in states like New York, where land is precious, whether it's in New York City or upstate or in Hudson Valley, and really thinking about how you minimize land impact are all sort of the things that we need to think about, and we need to think about how we do that better, because it is costly not to make decisions or to slow decisions because of uncertainty and fear. So we have to think about how do we get to a better place there. The other thing that we've learned along the way on transmission is the importance of accurate pricing. Also, this is where I sort of display my age. I've been in this industry long enough that we were operating in, when I was at Excel, before locational marginal pricing and congestion pricing on transmission, we were doing contract path. And I had situations where people were just crying for energy. In Chicago and Milwaukee, we had plenty of power coming out of Canada and Minnesota and Nebraska, but because of the planning models didn't show sufficient transmission, we couldn't get it there. Well, in fact, there was sufficient transmission. The problem is just the way we looked at contract path and those types of issues. So when we went to marginal pricing, and we were really taking a look at operating the system based on the electronic flows as opposed to a transactional flow, we drove efficiencies. So in PJM, for example, when we integrated AEP, when we integrated Commonwealth Edison, when we integrated Dominion, and increased the size in Eastern Power Connect of a single pool from 45,000 to 145,000, we improved the efficiencies throughout the system, simply by getting better information and understanding actually what the opportunities were, rather than just a contractual idea or a planning model of what the opportunities were. So those two things, if you think about it, really become part of what we're talking about in REV. Because the whole point of REV is to say, look, if we get better information and we use technology better, and we start thinking about the fact that distributed resources, whether it's energy efficiency or load control resources, allow us to drive efficiencies throughout the system, what we can do then is start thinking about how we, one, get efficiencies, but also get that information out there. So the types of things that we're thinking about with REV, and I notice I have 5 minutes, is to think about, how do we really solve some of these transmission issues. So one is looking at total system planning and modeling. One of the things that we're looking at in New York is we're going back and we're saying going forward, we really do need an integrated resource plan. We actually need to see what we're going to need for transmission and generation and pipeline going forward as we think about what we're trying to do in terms of renewables and what we're trying to do in terms of maximizing the value of distributed resources. So even though we used to do that when we had integrated utilities, we're finding it even more important now that we get people together and really at least have some strategies and scenarios for the future. The other thing what we're talking about is how do we move from production cost modeling on the transmission side. So when you think about it today, the way the ISO and we typically do modeling is we say if we change or add a generator, we look at the effect on production costs. It's like, instead of looking at it from the side of supply, let's look at it from the side of the customer. How do you optimize everything from the side of the customer so you're really considering losses reductions as well as the effect if you could add or subtract transmission. So you're looking at a whole look rather than just saying, well, a generator in and out, what does it do to cost? Third thing that we're talking about is saying, well, if we drive efficient demand, and we're really optimizing what we can do about demand response, thank you, Supreme Court, and we're really thinking about how we use load better, then when we go to communities and say we actually need transmission, we're able to demonstrate that we're doing everything we can to help manage costs, manage down demand, and we don't have a situation where they're saying, well, can't you do more? Why are you doing this? So, because we have a market designed around optimizing load first rather than last. The other thing that we're talking about is saying if we have better and more transparent information around pricing out distributed energy resources, we're going to be able to actually then, on a real-time basis, actually see the value of how we could use resources better and actually maybe reduce congestion with load. And so again, getting back to the point, issues around, well, do we really need transmission or not, becomes something that we put behind us. The other aspect of REV that's important is the idea of supporting competition. Because what will happen is transmission suppliers will have much better information about what the needs are on the system. They're going to know with the Clean Energy Standard, for example, exactly what New York is looking at in terms of wind and solar and other resources, so they'll have an idea of where those opportunities are. But they also have an opportunity to understand the competitive impacts of other forms of intermodal competition to transmission, whether it's DER, et cetera. To us, what that's going to drive is the opportunity for transmission developers to think innovatively how they can become a better solution, whether it's things like looking at DC rather than AC to interconnect resources, whether it's using technology better to increase the capability of the system. So it's not just transmission against transmission, it's transmission as a resource of a full complement of resources that will, we believe, will not only drive the ability for folks to think creatively, but also be able to drive customer and public acceptance, because there'll be confidence that we've looked at all the alternatives and this is the best alternative. So with that, because we only have a minute and I really do want to hear the rest of the panel, I think that to my mind, this is, we go back to sort of the axiom of energy. It's a single machine. What REV is looking to do is optimize that single machine, whether it's generation, whether it's transportation, whether it's usage, and thinking about it at the moment of consumption, what's the best way to go forward, both from a planning perspective and an operating perspective. By doing it this way, I think we recognize that moving forward, what we really want is not simply say, oh, we're going to distributed versus bulk power, but what we're really doing is developing a system that allows us to get where we want in the state, which is 50% renewables by 2030, but doing it in a way that we can assure our customers that we're doing it in a way that's most thoughtful for the environment across the board and as well as most cost effective. I certainly think that transmission is going to play an important role in that, but what I really think is that competition is going to make New York shine, that our transmission providers are going to show that they're using technology and intelligence to provide the best results to consumers. So thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Good morning. I'm Mark Lynch. I'm President and CEO of NYSEG and RG&E here in New York, and I want to thank the American for Clean Energy Grid and the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy for hosting the summit today. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me just for a minute. Last December, we actually formed a new holding company. Previous to last December, Iberdrola S.A., the Spanish company, was the single shareholder of NYSEG and RG&E. Back in December, they merged with UIL Holdings, creating a diversified, publicly traded energy and utility company, Avangrid. As you can see, Iberdrola S.A. owns 81.5% of Avangrid. 18.5%, almost 57 million shares, are publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange, AGR, the symbol. When you look at this company, it's about a $30 billion asset company. You have about $8 billion in the regulated business, and we operate in 25 states. We have three main businesses. We have Iberdrola Energy Holdings, which is a gas trading business down in Houston, Texas. They basically control about 120 BCF of natural gas storage. Iberdrola USA Networks, that owns or operates the 8 utility companies that NYSEG and RG&E are part of. And then you have Iberdrola Renewables, which operates about 5.6 gigawatts of wind power, basically in 53 wind farms in 18 states, making it the second largest wind producer in the U.S. Just as a note, Iberdrola S.A. is the largest wind producer in the world. Avangrid is committed to reducing our carbon footprint, setting targets to reduce emissions, and incorporating climate management into our business plans. Obviously, Avangrid is a proponent of clean energy. More closer to today's topic, NYSEG and RG&E, as utilities and subsidiaries of Avangrid, are advocates of continued modernization of the New York electric grid to make it highly interactive and provide customers with the products and services they want today and the REV products and services they'll want in the future. The modernization of New York Electric Grid will entail both the enhancement of existing transmission and the construction of new transmission, allowing for integration of large-scale renewable into the wholesale markets. When you look at NYSEG and RG&E, we've been very strong supporters of the REV. We have 2 active demonstration projects, Flexible Interconnect Capacity Solution that we work with Smarter Grid Solutions. We have the Community Energy Coordination Demonstration Project that we're working with Tative Engineering out of Ithaca, basically to help communities meet their energy needs. And then we're putting in place what we call an energy smart community up in Thompson County. Basically, it creates a test bed for REV initiatives or REV-like initiatives. We've also been very active in all of the proceedings and obviously the different trade groups. We believe that enhancing transmission to the REV and the energy highway objectives is key to New York State. Successful development of renewable energy projects to meet the goals of the Clean Energy Standard, the CES, which is part of the REV by replacing and enhancing the large-scale renewable component of REV, and the completion of Governor Cuomo's New York State Energy Highway Initiative are synergistic because they benefit and strengthen the value of each other. Meeting aggressive CES renewable energy policy goals require development of large-scale wind projects and other renewables in New York, and this development will require additional transmission capacity to transfer associated energy from favorable renewable sites, which may be remote areas of upstate New York, to the bulk power system, as well as mitigation of transmission congestion to enable statewide utilization of renewable energy. The energy highway should now be viewed as a blueprint for the successful utilization of renewable generation, as a blueprint basically resulting for the enhancement of CES component of RED. Also, the NISO, and Audrey touched on this a little bit, has identified that wind deliverability is a key issue on the siting of new renewable resources in New York. Accordingly, it is vital to clarify the role of enhancing transmission to address the energy deliverability from renewable sites to the bulk power system, as well as increased transmission congestion resulting from large-scale renewable and upstate generation. There's also transmission challenges. Audrey touched on one of these, and I actually think it's the most important one, and that is siting, specifically the Article 7 process in New York. When you look at that, that process has to be addressed and streamlined. We realize the customer impacts and the NIMBYism that you have a very strong advocate group here in New York, but it's very important that we move through this process. When you think about our planning studies that we do on the transmission side, building a large transmission project can take 7+ years when you look at going from planning to siting to actual construction. When you look at developing large-scale renewable projects, it's going to take a lot less time. That coordination, that planning is extremely important. Audrey hit on that a comprehensive plan on how we're going to have to build out the transmission system to basically supplement the increase in large-scale renewable, especially in remote parts of the New York system, is going to be very important. So in closing, as I stated earlier, NYSEG, RG&E Utilities, the subsidiaries of Avangrid, are advocates of the continued modernization of the New York electric grid to make it highly interactive and provide the services to customers and products they want today and the REV products that they'll want in the future. The modernization of the New York electric grid will entail both the enhancement of existing transmission and the construction of new transmission. It is very important to include transmission and its benefits in the REV discussion and not become solely distribution-oriented. Specifically, the need to bring clean, renewable energy into the wholesale market to meet the needs of the new Clean Energy Standard are imperative. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Sergej Mahnovski. I manage our Utility of the Future effort at Con Edison. I'd say this conference is very timely as we go from a concept to early implementation of REV. We have a REV unit that is now embedded into the operations of the utility, and also some of you might have seen last week there was an announcement of a new subsidiary for Con Edison Transmission. So very timely. As an aside, I do want to mention that the vision that Audrey, you, and Richard and the team have put forth to the state has probably spurred an entire generation of Columbia students who are now oversubscribing classes, I think, David, on anything related to REV. No matter how much REV is spoken, they still want more REV. So You really spurred that. So, I'm going to give the perspective of a wires utility here, and I'm going to reiterate what John and Audrey and Mark said. You know, transmission is a backbone of the grid, and I think we're looking at the punchline is we need both. We need both distribution, flexibility, and transmission, and the trick is how they interplay with each other. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the energy needs in New York City, our perspective on transmission, and then a REV demonstration project. A little bit about us. Most of you know about Con Edison. We're an investor-owned utility serving New York City and Westchester, more than 9 million people. What's interesting about us from the perspective of REV and transmission, our customers are very diverse. We have not only the biggest real estate developments in the nation in a dense vertical urban core, but residential and commercial customers across more than 1 million buildings, from large multifamily residences to single-family homes in more suburban areas of the city. We also have a significant local government presence. I see Anthony Fiore there, which require very high levels of reliability, 14 wastewater treatment plants that are in the city itself, and extensive subway systems. On the competitive side of the business, we have Con Ed Development, which is 6th largest owner and operator of utility scale solar assets, and as I mentioned last week, there's an announcement of a new subsidiary, Con Ed Transmission, which is investing in both electric transmission and gas midstream. I think, you know, what are our energy infrastructure needs looking forward, and how does REV impact our need for transmission? I think it's always useful to look at some historic trends. Historically, New York City, and this includes Westchester, has seen strong demand growth through a number of recessionary cycles, with only really 4 years of actual decline in peak demand since the late 70s, 3 of which were during the Great Recession. We've seen some bounce back of peak demand over the last couple of years, and a flattening on a weather-adjusted terms. Very difficult to predict the balance between what we're doing to shave peak demand and introduce energy efficiency into the system and native growth. You know, there's a couple observations. First, you know, our utility and the New York City metro region are fundamentally connected. Our customers generate almost 10% of U.S. GDP, and the economy's been somewhat resilient to recessionary shocks. So we need, you know, energy infrastructure to accommodate this growth. At the same time, peak demand is one of the drivers of capital costs for utility, and so introducing more flexibility in the grid, which is core to REV, is very important. And I think we have a phenomenal energy efficiency demand-side management team that's been looking at how to make the grid more efficient, and several REV demonstration projects that I think are very interesting. But from a transmission perspective, connecting the downstate region to resources is a good long-term bet. A couple more snapshots on New York City, which I think is important. As I mentioned, we see the economy rebounding in New York City. If you just look at the pace of construction happening around the city, residential, commercial, municipal. Just as an example, Hudson Yards, it's the largest mixed-use development, largest private development, one of the largest private developments in U.S. history. The first tower is opening up this spring. I believe in about 2 years, several more towers will come up with also a microgrid. So we've been working closely with Hudson Yards to configure help configure their system. So punchline is we're a growing economy that needs both traditional infrastructure as well as creative and flexible solutions on the distribution side. Let's start with the bulk system and then go in. I think interesting, Con Ed, our system is a bit unique as you increase the granularity. So starting at the big system, as most of you know, roughly 2/3 of our demand for electricity is in the southeastern part of the state, but only half of the state's generating assets are located there, which means you have flows going from north to south. And with the clean energy standard, with a 50% renewables target by 2030, and I know there's going to be panels after this, the grid will need to accommodate probably a significant amount of resources coming from other parts of, whether it's upstate New York or other places. The investor-owned utilities created the Transco. 3 Transco projects that are listed up here were approved under the PSC's Indian Point Contingency Plan. 2 are now under the PSC's AC transmission proceeding, and as I mentioned just last week, we announced the Con Ed transmission. So I have 3 minutes left. So as you go from bulk scale down to the distribution, there are some interesting observations. Our system is divided up into 64 networks in the underground system, and only about a fifth of them actually peak when the whole system peaks. So as we look at investments in our distribution grid, we have developed a number of programs to tailor to the needs of specific parts of the system. One interesting observation, as renewables ramp up and we see a significant amount of solar photovoltaic penetration, the majority of PV installations are night peaking networks. So the idea of making that system more flexible, turning what is an environmental asset essentially into an infrastructure asset, I think is key to us going forward. And here's the picture of the PV installations in the white dots versus the black areas, which are night peaking. And this is a graphic that I think is interesting for everybody to look at. The light blue areas are going to be, I'm sorry? Oh yeah, so light blue areas are starting at midnight, going through the morning. The light blue areas are underloaded networks. As they get towards red on a hot summer day, they approach their network peak. You can see 2 p.m. The load is really in Central Business District, Lower Manhattan, parts of Westchester, downtown Brooklyn. No big surprise, that's 2 p.m. As you get closer to the NISO peak, around roughly 4 or 5 p.m., you see which networks are loaded as people come home from work. So this is the interesting part where the divergence happens. When people come home from work, you see the movement towards residential neighborhoods and local peaking in the evening. So this is, I think, an interesting part of the way our system works. And then you see as we go to midnight. So I'm going to skip through a couple slides because I have just a couple minutes left, and I'm going to tell you about a REV demonstration project, which I think kind of connects the dots in some ways. This is our so-called clean virtual power plant. We're working with our partners SunPower and SunVerge to install several hundred solar panels and battery storage systems across several hundred homes in New York City and Westchester. The concept's exciting because we're going to be integrating advanced technologies with conventional solar PV systems behind the meter. So working with our partners, we're going to build out a grid-integrated control platform that will interface with their fleet-wide network operating center to create a virtual network of DERs in aggregation. It's going to be roughly, in total, 1.8 megawatts. And here's a picture of a conceptual schematic of that demonstration project, where we have our distribution control center connected with the NOC there. And in theory, in the future, you could have multiple such providers communicate with our system, and you could configure the system to dispatch the full load in Zone J, or network, or a local feeder. So there are still some interesting questions that I think we're working with the NISO and other stakeholders to develop as we think about connecting the bulk system and the distribution. What are the appropriate markets for batteries? What's the minimum threshold for participation? What's the window of obligation? Is it 4 hours? Is it 6 hours? Is it 2 hours? Time latency issues, the role of our distribution system platform, and whether those aggregators work through us or directly with the NISO. So a lot of interesting system architecture issues to be determined. So we're very, very excited about this demonstration project. And I've run out of time. Thank you very much for having me.
Steve, I'm gonna do this from here, if that's okay. I'm just gonna do this from the table here. John Wellinghoff with Stoll Reeves. I'm the co-chair of the energy practice with our law firm, and I'm hitting batting cleanup today, which is a good place to be in. Have no slides, but have a few comments, and I'll go into them somewhat briefly, although I first want to definitely thank David Sandalow and his team with the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy and all they've done to make this happen, and also John Jimison and his group with the Americans for Clean Energy Grid. Although I do have to say, David, I disagree with you in your opening remarks about Thomas Edison. If you said Nikola Tesla, I would have agreed. But Thomas Edison, I won't agree to that. So let me make 3 main points, sort of in summary from the things I've heard and the things I've thought about in this area of transmission, and I feel like somewhat of an outsider here for New York. We've got a New York panel, but for me, the Californian here, or actually Nevadan, now transplanted from Washington D.C. to California. But point number one, interestingly enough, I didn't hear anybody utter the words Order 1000 here at all. I think Order 1000 does have a lot of relevance to this issue and continues to have relevance to the issue and what the ISO in New York does with respect to that FERC order, that for those of you that may not be familiar with it, relates to transmission planning and does require that there be a periodic transmission planning process that is comprehensive and does intend to foster competition. I think it does a lot of the things that Chair Zibelman talked about and really intends to do here in New York, and I think it's very complementary to what a single state RTO like New York would do in conjunction with their PUC, such as California does and as New York and as Texas do. So I think Order 1000 continues to be relevant. I think it can enhance competition. I think it can enhance innovation and efficiency, and we shouldn't forget that tool as a tool to be used by the state and by its commission and by its utilities to assist in meeting its goals for efficient transmission. Second point that I want to make is the issue of transparency down to the underlying distribution level that I think goes along with a lot with what Sergej showed you about Con Ed and what they're seeing with respect to the information that they're developing. In order to do proper planning at the bulk power level, we have to have more and better information at the distribution level, because that's a very dynamic system. And it's a dynamic system that's changing rapidly, and it's in many ways impinging upon what those decisions are at the bulk power level. And the extreme example of this is Australia, where you're seeing actually penetrations of distributed generation at the 20-25% level now. And because of that, it's almost making long-line bulk transmission irrelevant in many places where they're really looking at actually microgrids. Now, I'm not suggesting that is something that's necessarily going to happen anytime soon in New York. And I'm also certainly very supportive of, and I think consistent with the position here that you will need to have more long-line transmission to deliver renewables from resource-rich areas where there's wind and solar that may be of higher value than you might have in your urban areas, to those areas to achieve the 50% renewable goal that New York is trying to achieve. But on the other hand, I think you need to continually look at what's happening in that distribution level. And by continually doing that, you need to then modify and dynamically change how you plan for that transmission and how that transmission is configured. And then that takes me to my third point. And the third point is, I think you really need to look at what I would call a term that I was kicking around the other day. A lot of people talk about resilience. I think you need to talk about dynamic resilience. And when I say dynamic resilience, what I mean is dynamically changing that transmission system through new electronic technology that is available and utilizing that in ways that it can be reconfigured in a relatively dynamic and ongoing way to meet the needs of the overall transmission requirements in the state, to meet the needs as things change at the distribution level, as things change at the bulk power level and at a central renewables deliverable level. And there's a number of utilities who are looking at that right now in New York. One is Central Hudson. I know they're looking at some very innovative technologies to, in fact, make their transmission lines dynamic. And so those are the kinds of new technologies that I think you need to incorporate into your planning process to make sure that you ultimately achieve your goals. Thank you.
So we'll start with some couple of softball questions, and then we'll turn over to the audience for the tougher ones. First, I'd like to ask, So we saw a fascinating slide from Serge of Con Ed's load and the peaking of the load by neighborhoods almost in the city over time through 24 hours. It's fascinating to see when the load was, particularly in the early evening. So the question is, if you believe that map, and we're going to get to 50% renewable, aren't we going to need a whole lot of storage? A whole lot of storage. Who wants to try that?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that all of us, what I'm just going to assume, looking at this panel, agree that the availability of storage is really going to help change the dynamic. So certainly the virtual power plant project that Sergej was talking about, I know Mark can probably talk about one of his projects that's also looking at how you integrate storage better. You know, we're all looking at it throughout the state because we see it as a great available resource. But I also want to make sure that we don't get sort of tripped up into thinking it's just about battery storage. We also talk about geothermal. We could also talk about the growth of electric vehicles. We could also talk about the thermal storage itself in buildings using load better. So really what REV is about is saying, look, we can do better load shaping. And that by doing better load shaping, using all of these available resources, we make sure that we are basically driving efficiency throughout the system. And therefore, when we're building transmission, we're building it because we're helping drive efficiency as opposed to dealing with peaks, loads, et cetera. So I think that definitely storage is great, but I also think that storage itself doesn't come into one flavor, and we don't want to necessarily just say it's all about batteries, although certainly batteries will play a very important role moving forward.
And Steve, I agree with Audrey, and I'd like to say I don't think it's about storage, I think it's about markets. I think it's about if we create the market structures, you'll have the resources come, whether they be storage, whether they be demand response, whether they be other things, to fill the needs of the system. So if we see that the system has needs, and structures are set up at a retail market and a wholesale market level appropriately to provide those correct market signals, then the resources will come.
Steve, may I just add, just because I want to pick up on John's point, just so we don't lose this in the conversation today. One of the things that the commission did and recently is we said we're going to move to LMP plus D, or LMPD, depending on how you want to talk about it. But the idea is taking locational pricing down to the distribution level, and as John said, unpacking the dynamic value of distribution, so you really are driving efficiency. And it is that market design that will tell us when you are able to put in fast responding resources to maintain voltage, maintain stability, use reactive power better, is to drive what kind of investments people will make. So it is, when I get back to it, it's all about getting accurate pricing throughout the system.
Sure. A couple things here that I think are important. And storage is going to be one of the keys that we have here, but there's storage in a lot of different ways, and I think Audrey hit on it. You have pump storage. You have other means of storage other than just batteries. The hydro is a good example. You can curtail hydro at certain times during the day and actually make it available depending on your roll curve that you have with your dams and your water table. You also have the capability either through pump storage, or we actually looked at a project a few years ago. It didn't really pan out economically, but it was actually a compressed air storage that we used out in the salt mines out in the middle of New York to basically then run them at peak times for a gas turbine, basically to supplement it and facilitate additional capacity. So there's a lot of ways to look at storage here. One thing I want to touch on, though, Audrey mentioned the LMP plus D. One of the important components here of LMP is congestion and the alleviation of congestion and making sure that you have free flow of power across your line. The better the transmission can facilitate the levelization of the LMP, I think you're getting a truer signal of what your distribution component of that is. And I think that's really important as we look at transmission, what it's doing, not only to bring large-scale renewable in, but also when you look at what the Transco's doing, for example, which we're part of along with Con Ed. especially on what we call the transmission owner transmission projects, the Indian Point scenario, where we're coming in and we're going to basically create about an additional 1,000 megawatts of transfer capability across that lower constraint. Very important. One of the things we're doing out in Western New York is working with NYPA, going to a Policy 1000 type of issue, where we're responding to a request to basically open up and alleviate a potential bottling of Niagara. That inherently, that transmission project is going to bring a reduction in emissions, because it's actually going to allow the unbottling of Niagara and bring it to the marketplace. So there's a lot of things that can happen here, either through storage or transmission itself, to help alleviate and really balance out this system.
Steve, I'd agree with all the panelists. I think storage is important, but it's not the only technology. A couple lessons we learned from, or are learning from, some of you heard of our Brooklyn Queens demand management program. So we're looking to defer a traditional investment for a number of years, a traditional substation enhancement, and substitute instead largely customer-sited resources. It's a very large asset that's being deferred, so it's not a one-for-one. You will probably have tens of thousands of customer-sited and some grid utility-sided technology. So first, the technology portfolio, you need a bundle that can function equivalently with equivalent reliability and resilience as the traditional infrastructure. So we're learning what those bundles are, and it's going to be a combination of, at its base, energy efficiency. You might have fuel cells, you might have batteries, you might have solar, you might have demand response. It's going to be that whole bundle. We're not quite there for the pure market signal. I think we may get there, because the other component that's tricky is customer behavior and also customer acquisition. So if you look at the first 9 megawatts, for example, of a 50 megawatt solution has required roughly 3,000 engagements, 3,000 customers and contracts. That's a lot. And if you look at particularly, these are residential, rent or occupied, in some cases low and moderate income areas. It's not a plug and play solution yet. So using virtual audits and community organizations and trying to understand the customers and bringing them to the table is still where we are. So the interesting thing is we talk about value of D is what we want to get. How do you maybe unbundle some of those attributes and price them out properly? So I think that's kind of the state of the art right now that we're all working on. We're modeling it. We're trying to learn those lessons, and that's the direction that we're going to be going in.
The second softball question is, in order to meet the renewable targets, do we need thousands of megawatts of additional transfer capacity to downstate?
One of the things, as I mentioned, that we're looking at through working with the ISO and Order 1000, as well as the state planning process, is taking a look at what type of scenarios should we be thinking about in terms of integrating wind and solar into the system. So I don't know if it's thousands of megawatts. Certainly, we are doing a number of different projects today. As Mark talked about several years ago, we looked at the Indian Point contingency, developed a number of projects. NYPA's got a number of projects I'm sure Gil can talk about. So, all of these things are going to help. And there's opportunities. I mean, we have certainly a pending, we approved several years ago, the commission did, a project coming out of Hydro Quebec, which would build, I think it's about 1,000 megawatts of hydro into New York City through a DC tie. And so there are other things that we can do. I think it's premature, quite frankly, to talk about where we're headed. I think that certainly New York also is a great place for offshore wind as we start to think about that technology and how we could drive costs down. So there's a lot of ways this could unfold, and that's one of the reasons, as the commission develops a clean energy standard, we're going to want to make sure that we are giving ourselves the opportunity to allow technology to develop, and that we're following the yield curve on benefits, and that we're not rushing to say it's going to be this way or that way, because as we all know, technology in this space is evolving extraordinarily rapidly, and we would be foolish not to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think I touched on it, and Audrey had actually touched on it in her opening comments, that the planning really becomes the key here. And when the NYSO did their study, it's been quite a few years ago now, talking about the integration or the capability of the system to integrate about 6,000 megawatts of wind. It was a different system back then. There's a lot of things that changed both at the local level, but also on large projects, such as what the Transco is doing, what's being proposed in some of the Order 1000 projects. So there's a lot more capability and transfer capability in the system. And I think the key here is planning. I think you have to see what your system is at any one time. You need to see where you want to go. I do believe, though, that you are going to need to increase your large-scale renewables. I think there's a place for the distribution level behind the meter, the DER, the microgrids. But I think when you look at meeting the 50% goal, it is going to require us to really put in some large-scale renewables. And I think you're going to have to analyze and plan for that transmission system. One of the keys that the NISO had talked about was the deliverability. Most wind is in remote areas up in upper state New York. To really get that to the bulk system and make it deliverable to where your load is downstate has to be planned and coordinated. A lot of things we're doing now, and I think Audrey's correct, it's a little premature to say how much is going to be needed. I think this has to be studied and planned out. As we go through this proceeding on the Clean Energy Standard, I think all that's going to play out, a lot of it, this year as we get into next year.
In 1983, I wrote what was then the first Integrated Resource Planning Act in the state of Nevada, which then became sort of a model for about 19 other states that did integrated resource planning. And in that act, we set up a process where the utility would engage in a 20-year planning forecast that would be a rolling forward every 3-year process, and they would change it on a 3-year basis and continue that plan and roll it forward. And it worked pretty well for Nevada. It's worked for a lot of other states. Then a number of states like New York and others that went to a more restructured system ultimately moved back from integrated resource planning, and now Chairman Zibelman's talking about going back to that process, which I think is good. But I think when we do that, if we're going to really understand how much transmission is needed to deliver large-scale renewables, whether it be thousands of megawatts or whether it be more or less than that, we need to make that transmission planning process much more dynamic. It's got to be ongoing. It's got to be constant. It can't be, once every year or once every 3 years as we did in Nevada. It's got to be daily kind of situation where you're constantly looking at what's happening at the distribution level, how that's evolving, how that evolution is progressing, and doing constant forecasts of that progression, because otherwise it's going to get away from us, because things are happening so dynamically down at the customer level that I don't think we really recognize that are going to have very profound impacts on how much of that transmission actually needs to get put in place.
So that was my last, and then we'll turn it over for a half hour. So it warmed this soul to hear the term integrated resource planning again. I thought I never would again. And the term plan and planning repeatedly. So there's obviously a tension between integrated resource planning and truly integrated, like in the 80s, where we were trying to make sure that the demand side, what we said then, was fully counted on an equal level playing field with supply side. So, but there's a natural tension between, isn't there, between integrated resource planning, whether it's daily or every 3 years, and leaving it to the market. So how's that resolved?
I don't think there's a tension. I think it's complementary. I mean, we're talking about long-lived assets that we understand have significant land impact, and we want to be thinking in terms of needs moving forward. I mean, the one thing about electricity, of course, that is the truism we all know, is that when you need it, and we can't sort of wait for scarcity and say, oops, we better start looking at this issue. So we always have to be ahead of the game. But as John said, that doesn't mean you put a plan there and say we're sticking to the plan. Regardless of reality, we continue to update the plan based on actual experience. So in my mind, you sort of do, it's almost like a Six Sigma approach to the world. You sort of have a view on where you want to go. You have actions that you take to provide really good information and markets that are designed to drive innovation so that you're driving efficiency and you're driving the best results of all time. And you're constantly updating and saying, well, this, do we need this? Do we need that? But if you don't have a sense of the vision and a sense of the need, and that's one of the things that the commission said is, to get REV done, the first thing we need is a really strong target. We need to know that where we're headed. 50 by 30 is where we're headed in this state. Now we're all about how do we use markets information to get to that place in the least cost way for consumers in the best way, and use as advances of technology to drive efficiencies so that our environmental goals and our economic goals become one and the same as opposed to diverse. So I think it all happens, and I don't see it as a tension. I think it's a wise way to go forward. You think where you're going, you figure out the best way to send the right information, you animate as many actors as you can, and then you continue to look at the results to figure out what your next step is, which is exactly the way business is conducted and the way I think we need to conduct ourselves in New York.
Yeah, and I would agree in the sense that I don't think you can really have markets, effective markets anyway, until you have a plan. In other words, the plan informs the markets and the market structures. And that's really what we did at FERC. When I was at FERC, we really looked at what we were trying to do. We were trying to be inclusive. We were trying to incorporate into those markets as many diverse resources as possible. So we created orders that recognize the value of fast response regulation service from batteries and flywheels. We created orders that recognize the value of demand response equal to the value of generation. So we had a plan, and that plan really informed how we really structured those markets. So I think the two are very complementary.
Yeah, I think this is a really delicate balance, because you want to keep the markets in play here as opposed to just forcing generation at a certain site. And I think you said it before, that somehow the planning needs to morph us so that we can show where the assets can go, what needs to be done, and basically cost them out. It's a delicate question, because true integrated resource planning done in the old traditional way could have an adverse impact on the market, which we don't want to do, but done in the right way and a balance there, as you said, can actually create some benefit. And it's basically blending those two together that is going to be really interesting to see how we can do that.
I'm confident if we turn it to questions now in the audience. I know we're bound to get some questions. Paul Sandalow is here, Jim Hecker, Quinones, Hederman. We're bound to have some questions, so help me out here.
Sure. I'm Chris King with Siemens, and we're big believers in price signals and big believers in LMP plus D. And I have a couple of questions, related questions around LMP plus D. And one of them is, how do you monetize D? There's a cost-benefit framework that's been issued by the Commission that lists various things that could be included in those benefits. But how does that get monetized? Does the distribution company buy those? Do those get bid into NISO in some way? So that's one issue. And then the other issue is, how does that change over time? And that sort of gets at the question of, if I'm investing at a place, I know from LMP plus D location, and I know value, but I don't know value over time. So how do I make those investments?
So the question was about that mysterious D factor affecting LMP and also its time varying effects. Anyone want to?
Well,
Take
I
on
mean,
that?
the
Yes.
way we're conceptualizing this now, and we have a proceeding going on, and we've asked, frankly, a number of people to comment and think about how do we evolve towards there. In my own thinking, just like LMP itself, this is going to be an evolution, and so clearly geography matters, and so it's an avoided cost of geography. Clearly temporal issues matter, as Sergej said, even to the point that we want to go circuit by circuit. You can't simply say it's D, New York City, Zone J. It's circuit by circuit, and so getting to that level of granularity, I don't think is going to be a heavy lift, because we actually have that information now. It's largely aggregated in the LMPs, and now it's just a process of disaggregating those zones. Then I think we have an opportunity to go further, and I know Central Hudson's working on this issue, and we have companies that are actually looking at unpacking the D and thinking in terms of reactive power, thinking about a voltage. And so from my perspective, as we move along, it's almost like we did LMP. We started with hourly markets, and then day ahead, and then we moved to ancillary, and then we moved to a transmission congestion. We didn't all just say, this is it. So I think we will start, and it's important that we start, and then as we get higher degrees of penetration and see actually the hosting capability, because we're really driving this around that concept, we will actually see more dynamic pricing at the distribution level. I heard about a company last week that does trading among DER providers so that they can actually see how they can rely on each other. So I think that this will all evolve. I think that the place we're starting is a sensible place of looking at geography and temporal, and then we will, through this process, continue to see how you evolve that to a much more sophisticated number. The other thing you have to realize, and this is something, and I'll let others speak, this is a little different than when we went to this on the wholesale level, where we went to LMP pricing and all the assets were in place. A good portion of what we're trying to do in REV is actually create the market. We don't have the level of distributed generation today that we're going to want in the future. What we want to do is build the market to set the right price signals, and then as those investments get made, make sure that they're monetized correctly. So it's not a chicken and an egg. It's really, let's make sure we have a build-on trajectory that's sensible.
Yeah, and Chris, I think I understood there's two parts to your question. One is, what are the principles of the valuation itself? And then what is the market design? How is it going to be implemented? On the principle of the valuation, the way we look at it ultimately is if you're going to open up investment to third parties based on a market signal, you'd want that D really to offset another type of cost, so that you're essentially not increasing the costs of the grid. And so that's a lot of work in progress right now. Utilities and other parties and DR providers are working on that. There's going to be a proceeding on that. What are the principles of valuation? If you're deferring capital, for example, how do you put that into that D? If there's a portfolio of assets that can do that, how do you look at any single asset in there? So I think that's an active topic. On the issue of how do you then ultimately create a market design and execute on it, the economically pure argument might be, let's go to a high level of granularity both in space and time, but that may be too volatile for an investor who is looking at some durability in that price signal. And so that's the other tension, if you will. What kind of compromises do we make? What is workable? What's a durable model? So I think we're going to learn over time, and I think the first example of that will be in our DSIP filings that are going to be later this summer on how we're going to evolve our system planning and how we're going to open aspects of it to third parties.
I'm Vinay Venkatraman from Colombia. Sergej Mahnovski had spoken about PV not being an environmental asset but also an infrastructure asset. My question is, he had spoken on 3 major locations which had daytime peaks, that is certain areas of Westchester, downtown Manhattan, and downtown Brooklyn, while these 3 areas didn't have much of the PV installations. Is there any way that the companies can get increased incentives for those areas so that those are the areas that deploy more PV without seeming unfair to the other customers? Secondly, is there any way to get more mixed-use projects or request the required authorities for more mixed-use projects? Because once mixed-use projects are there are more mixed-use projects, either within the same building or within an area, then you can balance the load. Thank you.
Do you want to go?
Either way, I can.
Yeah, I've been doing
Good
a lot.
question.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Steve.
you want me to? Oh, jeez. So the whole principle of the value of D is that you might get a different price signal by location for the export of your electrons into that network. So that's a concept that you bring up the fundamental point of fairness, which I think is an active one, and that's part of this issue of geographic granularity and how far do you go down there. So I think we're talking about export into the system and pricing at the value that injection brings. So I think it's an active topic. Right now the concept is it's valued differently, but I think you bring up it's a very fair question.
I think then on the mixed use, clearly that's what we'd like to see is more of what we call systems of systems. So one of the things that the commission has done is really ask the utilities to start developing what we call these demonstration projects. These demonstration projects really aren't about technology, it's around creating better business models. And also, though, as Sergej said, it's really starting to operationalize how do we think about human behavior as a resource and understanding that, because that'll be a very important part. Because when you think about what we're doing in REV, we're saying for the first time we're going to be building the system assuming that load will not be there. And so we have to be absolutely confident that we understand enough how these resources can be used and operated, because if somehow, for some reason, as we see, those of us who operate know there's a saturation point where people will stop conserving because they're just too darn hot, is we need to understand how to avoid that, because if that load pops back up, guess what? That substation's not there to pick it up. We deliberately build the grid so it's not there. So these demonstrations and understanding how these resources work collectively are a very critical part of what we're doing.
Yeah, I just may want to throw in comment on your, I guess, being competitive, or is this unfair to some developers? If you look at the analogy of how the wholesale market, smart developers knew where to develop their projects and how to get them there to avoid the congestion on the transmission system or get them close to load or make sure that they're deliverable. I think as we develop the distribution side, you're going to have that same thing. We've got an inordinate amount of interconnection requests on our system at NYSEG and RG&E. And the smart developers are the ones that are going out, looking at the load, looking where best to put their facilities so that it doesn't cost a lot to upgrade the system or put in new lines on the distribution side that makes them non-cost effective. So that's what competition is. It's not a question of fairness. I think it's a question of who are the smart people out there who are going to get to the better locations first, create the better value for their company and their products to basically put them where the value is.
Do we have a
Hey,
question
hi.
here? Yes?
I am Navneet Trivedi. So I heard this, my question is from Mr. Bellenhoff. I heard about the dynamic planning, and I'm an electrical engineer. I'm just wondering that if you
Yeah, good double E. Yes.
yeah, it's electronics, that's why. So the notion of dynamic planning, I'm not able to quite understand, because if in the context of transmission, if you talk about everyday planning, you cannot build anything. So I can understand as an electrical engineer, you can have a dynamic operation, but not a direct dynamic planning that way. You have to build a transmission line like for 30 years, and somebody need to, and you may have a notion or risk of, stranded cost in that, built in that, and which maybe we have to figure out how to get it socialized. But the question, like, I'm not quite understanding the concept of dynamic planning as it relates to transmission.
Sure, I'd be happy to. There are new technologies out now. I won't name any names because I will readily admit they're clients. But there's new technologies out now that actually allow you to dynamically change the impedance of a line. That is, to push or pull more power through a line. And the other interesting thing about these technologies, these electronic devices that ultimately will allow you to dynamically do that on a as-needed basis, you can move these things around in different places on different lines. So if you can do that, you can ultimately dynamically schedule your lines and then decide if certain lines aren't as congested as they were before, but other ones over here are. You move the devices from here to there. And so you can do that all dynamically in real time over months or years or whatever is necessary to dynamically plan your line. So the technology's out there. We just need to embrace it and utilize it.
Hi, I'm Ankita and I'm from mechanical engineering. I'm studying energy systems. I have a specific question to Sergej, and this is so we just barely touched upon the topic of demand response, and with the current Supreme Court ruling, I want to know, where does utility stand in current response management today? And one more, and a technical question in that aspect is, how do you quantify the benefits of demand response management, and how do you share it between the utilities and the customers? And where do you see it going?
A lot of questions in there. Let me see if I can unpack that. So, so first on the status of our demand response programs, I think I had a slide earlier. Within New York City or Zone J, we have something on the order of more than 400 megawatts of NISO special case resources. So those would be responsive to the NISO calls for the system-wide. We also have programs that are tailored more for individual networks or contingencies. Those are on the order of a couple hundred megawatts, and some of those programs overlap. And so there's different, where we are today in pricing for some of these programs and where we might be in the future, that would likely evolve. I mean, where you want to get to, I believe, is on the demand response. If you think about some of the costs of our system are driven by marginal costs within certain networks of capital expenditures. So as we go towards this market-based environment, we're talking about linking LMP plus D and the valuation. That's generally you want to go in the direction of what kind of capital are you avoiding, and how does that feed into the signal for demand response? But I'd say there's a significant amount of demand response in the system right now, and it's actually a very important resource in hot summer days.
If I could, let me just add to that. So on a couple things that the commission is requiring utilities to do. I mentioned the demonstration. The other, as Sergej mentioned, is we're doing what we call distribution system integration plans. And I think that's going to be very complementary to Order 1000, but it's also very important because for the first time, what we're doing in New York is we're creating transparency, and it gets back to your question as well, is about developers. The problem with monopolies is there is always asymmetric transparency. What we're doing with New York is getting rid of that asymmetry and making sure everybody understands where the needs are, and so where you can put resources. I agree with Sergej, there's an avoided D concept, avoided investment, but I also think as we move on, what we're going to find is, as John was talking about, is there's a dynamic cost too. And so it's not just avoiding capital, it's actually operating the system more efficiently. And why we're moving to LMPD is because it all gets down to that last increment of demand and supply and where they meet, not at the bulk power system, but at the load. So getting there, I think, excuse me, is we are going to be moving towards a very efficient pricing model down to the point of consumption. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it really is the only model that works.
Do we have a...
Oh. So, I really appreciated your talk about the tensions between like the planning and the market forces, because I mean it's got to be kind of intense because it's such a capital intensive industry that it's very difficult. I mean you also have to plan. It's not like the average consumer can say, hey, I want more storage, and then it's 5 to 10 years down the line. So it's a very, very interesting like interplay. But to that planning point, what role do you see in terms of like time frames? Because obviously there's a climate change like kind of urgency to what's going on. It's still a very, very uncertain time frame to me at any rate. And then from everything that you're saying, it sounds like energy efficiency would make almost the whole process a lot easier for all of the things that you're planning on doing. How do you see that as being how important do you see that as being in terms of like requirement? And then most importantly, what role do you see of regulation in that process? One, they've talked about carbon taxes, and two, my favorite is building code.
So, why don't I start here? So last, was it 2 weeks ago? Time flies. The commission approved two things. Well, we approved the Clean Energy Fund. Under the Clean Energy Fund, New York has identified that over the next 10 years, we're going to be collecting $5 billion to invest in largely energy efficiency as well as renewables. But with that, with the focus of NYSERDA changing from a procurement model to where really we look at market issues such as building codes. Because our belief is that if we look at the market restrictions to energy efficiency and really focus on creating business models around that, what we're going to see is that we're going to be able to get a lot more bang for our buck. And so the anticipated plan is with a $5 billion investment in energy efficiency, we're going to animate close over $29 billion of private capital. And the net is we're going to achieve $39 billion of economic savings. So it's an extremely good investment. The other piece that we're doing is we continue with the utility process is to think about having utilities do programs around energy efficiency as they develop their integration plans and helping create businesses around that. So for us, when the state is looking at its 30 by 50 target on renewables, built into that is an assumption of a significant amount of energy efficiency reductions associated with markets. It's close to a 20%, I can't remember the MBTU right now, but it's a significant component of how we're going to get there. So we see this from both sides. And one of the things that we've asked, the Commission has asked in its Clean Energy Fund, is for the utilities to work with NYSERDA and work with stakeholders to create very efficient models around the procurement of energy efficiency, because we realize it's a lot of improvement we can get done. So for us, it's never a say, well, we're just going in one direction. We recognize there's a portfolio, but actually managing demand is probably the most economic thing we can do, and we need to maximize what we're doing on that as we're building towards a more renewable future.
You brought up, I think, an interesting concept about planning horizon. And as I mentioned earlier, I think what's interesting is we're going from concept now into implementation. And so as our engineers kind of dive into this and think about how to implement, and I'm not an expert in this, I think Mark and John and others would know, if you look at the kind of capital expenditures that a distribution utility undertakes and the visibility on the planning horizon might be a little bit different than on the transmission system. On the distribution system, you have requirements for items that need emergency replacement within hours all the way up to years. So you have a distribution of, if you will, of different planning time spans for different parts of the system. And as we look at for example, the benefit cost analysis order that came out, one question for planners that people are actually responsible for the physical outlay of the system is, how do you look at that planning horizon, and what is realistically something that is part of kind of a non-wires alternative versus something that's done kind of in the course of business within hours, emergency capital, for example. So that's I think is an interesting analogy that might break down between transmission and distribution. I'm not sure if that's the case, but it's something that our folks are now kind of doing a deep dive on that. So.
I'm gonna interject a quick question, and then we'll see. So one thing I did want this conference is about transmission. But if you look at the model of what's going on, one of the things that's going on at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission presently, we have increasing and intense opposition to something that used to be relatively easy compared to transmission, which is gas pipeline development. So entrenched that gas pipeline development, every project seems to be a big slog like what we had in electric transmission. So I think a lot of us feel that doing everything that is possible on the customer side of the meter and demand side should establish the case that after you do that, then we still need some transmission. But my question is, we have a public, and in some cases opposition, that even with those facts are still going to fight in transmission as they're increasing in gas pipelines. So who wants to take that one?
Let me try that, Steve, since you started out with FERC. And I'm actually very aware of what's happening at FERC. I mean, it really is quite disruptive. People literally laying down in the aisles in the auditorium there that they have to haul people out. But I think a lot of it is motivated by people who have a very sincere concern and desire to do what they can, at least what they perceive they can, to get us in the right path with respect to climate change. And I think they see gas pipelines as in some way having negative impacts on that to the extent that we're extracting more natural gas and utilizing it and burning it. So I think we have an opportunity with transmission lines, a different opportunity, if we can convince the general public and especially those people who have deep-seated concerns about climate change, as I do, that these transmission lines can in fact make the situation better rather than worse if we're trying to deliver large amounts of renewables from places where there's high concentrations of high-quality wind and or solar. I think hopefully people can understand that there are real benefits to these lines, even though there are visual impacts and other potential community impacts. I think you can differentiate them from the gas pipelines and the people who are protesting on the gas pipelines.
One thing I'll say is the nice thing about New York is they're an equal opportunity employer. They don't like gas pipelines. They don't like transmission lines.
We have, last question. It was someone was holding a mic.
I'm going to
Yes.
cede my time to Chairman.
Well, we need another half hour then.
Thanks. Just following up on the first question, John had brought up Order 1000 earlier, and I thought I'd seize this opportunity to get his view on whether his initiative, which he gets tremendous credit for, it's the most important thing FERC has done in the last decade, I think, whether it's performing at the level that he expected, particularly with regard to interregional transmission, cost allocation. Does FERC need to do more? What's your report card?
Well, I think it's slow. I mean, I think we could probably give it a C+ on the report card, and I think in part the reason that it has not reached its full potential or is not reaching a higher potential is because it is difficult to participate in the ISO's RTO processes, and those processes are typically dominated by the transmission owners and or generators, and as such, other voices and other views don't often get enough attention in those processes. I think though we are starting to see more aggressive and interested outside development from third parties outside of the incumbent jurisdictions where the transmission lines exist, coming in and looking at doing projects that are competitive. I know that there was a competitive project awarded in PG&E's service territory in the Cal ISO to NextEra recently. And I know there's been a number of other instances where competitive proposals have, in fact, won the bids in those processes. So I think it's a framework that's there to be used, a tool, and it can be used much more effectively than it is being used, but I think the opportunity is still there.